Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome back to the Summer Short Series where we are getting the nerdy details on specific subjects all summer long while we gear up for Season 3 of the long-form interviews we always do. Today on the show, Jackson Roulette, my partner at no-tillgrowers.com, who is helping me conduct some of these interviews over the summer, caught up with a Season 1 guest, Shawn Jadrnicek of Wild Hope Farm, to talk about their work scaling up from 6 to 12 acres in cover crops and how that's coming along. Really fascinating stuff, including discussions of germinating cover crop seed in a drought, tarping on that scale if they're going to start trialing that, roller crimping, obviously battling summer weeds in the south, which is a big deal here, and so much more. So big thank you to Jackson and Shawn for this conversation, which we could not bring to you without the help of our show sponsor, you. You, the Patreon members, you are the people who kick us a few bucks every month, either at patreon.com/farmerjesse or at Venmo, and keep this thing going. You are the engine that runs our work. So don't just consider signing up. Consider what this information means to you. Is it worth $2 a month? $5? If so, go over to patreon.com/farmerjesse and kick in a few dollars a month for this content if it brings you value. We greatly appreciate that support, and at a certain level, or if you just bump up your pledge from $2 to $5, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to JM Fortier, Kevin Keene, Ryan Gosser, Yannick LaPlante, and Nate Merkel, my buddy Nate Merkel. Thank you all. All right, enough for me. Let's get into this amazing conversation between No-Till Growers co-creator Jackson Roulette and Shawn Jadrnicek of Wild Hope Farm.
So, Shawn Jadrnicek, thanks for joining us during the growing season. I know it's busy. It's the end of May. We've had a lot of rain here in the South, and you're having to deal with that. So thanks for taking a minute to talk with us about the summer cover crops and what we can think about for the rest of the season.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
So the last time that we talked to you, way back in episode 4, it was almost 2 years ago. Can you give us an update since then? Like where have you come from since 2 years ago at Wild Hope Farm?
Basically been doubling our production every year. So started out at about quarters of an acre. I think we were 3 acres 2 years ago, and then last year we did 6 acres, and then this year we scaled up to 12 acres of production. So kind of growing rapidly. Our CSA is up to 355 now, and we're also doing about an acre of wholesale and then a farmer's market on top of that. So busy, definitely busy.
So toward the end of last year, I know you were trying to establish some late summer cover crop to get prepared for your spring production when you were expanding into a new field. But you were also doing it when it was coming a really bad drought here in the South. Can you explain what happened and how all that turned out?
August or so, I like to plant a winter-killed cover crop of cowpeas. And this year I'm actually going to mix it in with cowpeas and Sudex. I think cowpeas are great, but the Sudex will help build more carbon, and that's one of our goals here is to just build more carbon with the soil, so adding that grass is key. But I usually do a planting of cowpeas and Sudex and let that winter kill, and that'll be an area where our early spring crops will go into, that winter killed cover crop. Didn't have the rain during that time of year last year, so basically nixed that and then had to go right into our winter cover crop. I was concerned about, I planted that cover crop and the rains never came, and I was concerned about it not germinating. So we did try to get some water on it with a sprinkler and did get some of it up that way. Wasn't able to get all of it up in the whole field, but I haven't seen any. I think we did have a late rain and it did germinate, and then it only got like a few inches and then winter killed. So I think we didn't have I was worried about a weed problem with that cover crop that I planted coming up this year. The seeds didn't get a chance to germinate, but they did, and they did winter kill. But basically had to nix that and then go right into our winter cover crop, which was a cereal rye and crimson clover mix.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to let your cover crop become the weed problem for the next season.
Mm-hmm.
So just thinking back on that, do you have any well, I guess you've already said, what are some of the things that you do to mitigate maybe if you don't have a good germination or if you have to go to a plan B with a cover crop? On your scale, of course, you're doing a lot of tractor and roller crimping. What are some of the things that you keep in mind if you have trouble with a particular cover crop?
Yeah, so this past winter, we ended up purchasing a hose reel sprinkler system, which allows us to irrigate, an acre a day. So it's basically just this giant sprinkler, and it's attached to a giant reel, and you use the tractor to pull the sprinkler down the field, and then it slowly retracts onto that reel. I think ours is a Kifco 180 or 140 model, and just retracts slowly to the reel, and then can irrigate a very large area pretty quickly. So we're looking at using that to irrigate our cover crops. I did try this spring using it to irrigate some of our early spring brassicas, which worked all right, but I think in retrospect, I'd rather have those on drip, just because the drip helps with weed pressure, because you're not irrigating, the weeds in between the crops. And drip is just so much easier because you can automate everything, so it doesn't take as much work. And with those crops, early spring crops like the broccoli and the kale and the cauliflower and all that stuff, they need a lot more water than a cover crop would need. A cover crop you could just irrigate once, and it will usually take off pretty good with rainfall after that. So it's a little more difficult to use the hose reel with your cash crops, but it is possible. We're also looking to use that to kind of keep our fall planted crops cooler, because we have to plant our brassicas when it's still really hot here for our fall crops. So we're looking at using that sprinkler to help water them in and keep them cool. That's kind of been an issue, is not being able to irrigate or cool those crops when we put those in. But hopefully that'll help, the hose reel. And then without water, you just can't get plant growth. So that's one of the issues with cover cropping. If you have to rely on rainfall, you're very limited. Yeah, so we're doing something different in one of our fields this year. Our harvest manager, Rachel, had an idea to just set up a dedicated area for direct seeding. And I've really enjoyed that. And that dedicated area has, a wobbler style system, except we're not using wobblers. We're using a sprinkler system called, they're made by Netafim, and they're called MegaNet. And I like them a little better than the wobblers because it retracts into a casing, so you don't have to worry about insects and spiders clogging them. And they have like a whole line. You can get different, flow rates that can. Yeah, the only thing that is you've got that pipe going through your field that's above ground, and every time you need to cultivate with a tractor, you've got to move that pipe out of the way.
Yeah.
So it does complicate cultivation with the tractor.
But what are some of the things that you look for? Say if you're growing a cover crop over the summer, what is something that you would grow, and about how long would it take to reach maturity, and what do you look for when you're terminating that cover crop to be able to go to plant into it later on?
Yeah, the summer cover crops, most of them tend to decompose pretty quickly, especially during the heat of the summer, and if you have a lot of moisture that's coming down, they're going to decompose very rapidly. The only exception to that would be Seedex, which sticks around much longer. It's a little more cellulosic. But it's a great biomass producer, but it just produces so much biomass, and that biomass is resistant to more resistant to decay. So it's a little harder to deal with. Most of the other cover crops I use, cowpeas, maybe mix that with millet. Those can basically decompose very rapidly, especially if you just use cowpeas alone. I mean, you can turn the field over in a few days with cowpeas just because of how rapidly it decomposes. But Yeah, otherwise you've got to give it enough time to break down. And it also kind of depends on how, late you grow that cover crop to, what stage you grow it to. Like with cereal rye, a winter cover crop, if you're going to till that in, and you need to get into your field pretty early, you don't want it to grow past, like knee high or so. It's just going to be too resistant to decay. The summer cover crops, sun hemp has given me some problems. The stems on that can get pretty tough. And you can avoid some of those issues by just mowing those cover crops if they get too tall or too woody, mowing them down to like a shorter size and letting them resprout. A lot of the grasses, sun hemp will resprout, but cowpeas might not resprout as well. But if you run into a problem where you want to, prevent it from getting to a stage where it's too tough to decompose, just mow it, and then you can keep it around a little longer, but it won't be so woody.
Yeah, that's a good tip, especially, when you're wanting to plant right into that mulch afterward, or you're wanting to deal with it in a way that's not going to give you problems. You can give it a mow, and just make it easier to deal with down the line, or put off the termination a little bit. So, yeah, listening back to the last episode, you had mentioned searching for, I think you call it a golden ticket, like your crimpable summer cover crop or your ideal summer cover crop or mix. Have you made any progress on that, or is there anything that you've tried or that you're going to try that you think gets you a little closer?
Yeah, we actually we wrote a grant. So one treatment is going to be sun hemp at 100 pounds per acre. And sun hemp will crimp, and it'll terminate with the crimping. But the problem that I've had with sun hemp is that it gets a lot of light underneath that canopy, and you can get some weed growth underneath the sun hemp, like in between the plant. And it does eventually block that sunlight, but there's kind of like a time lapse where it doesn't give you good enough ground cover, and we get this horrible weed called it's like southern crabgrass. And once that gets in your, the problems that I've had with crimping these summer cover crops is you crimp it, the cover crop dies, but then the crabgrass is in there, it doesn't die, and then you just have this horrible weed problem with the crabgrass. So, so one treatment is going to be sun hemp, but at a very high rate, 100 pounds per acre. But I seeded that a couple weeks ago, and I was just looking at it today, and it doesn't look like that's a high enough rate. I think you almost need to treat it like you would maybe cereal rye and go for like 150 pounds per acre, but then that ends up becoming very expensive. But on a small scale, it might be worthwhile. All right, so the second treatment we're going to try is sun hemp at 100 pounds per acre, and then Japanese millet at 50 pounds per acre. So those are high rates for both of those, even if you planted them alone. But I think combining them together, and that's probably worked the best for me in the past, that combination. You have to be really careful with the Japanese millet because it goes to seed after about 50 days or so, and it goes to seed. The seed becomes viable very quickly, and if it does go to seed and you get that seed in your field, it's going to be a horrible weed following year. So you've got to be careful with that. So we're also going to try a mixture that gets rid of that. So another treatment is going to be sun hemp at 75 pounds per acre, soybeans at 50 pounds per acre, and then buckwheat at 50 pounds per acre. So with that one, we're hoping that the buckwheat maybe will smother that crabgrass and prevent it from germinating, give us some quick cover. And then the sun hemp and the soybeans would give us, the material that would give us more of a mulch effect later on. So with that treatment, I'm probably expecting the buckwheat, to have some viable seeds. But buckwheat doesn't seem to be that much of a weed problem if you do let it go to seed. Haven't had that much issues with it. And then we're going to try a fourth treatment that's going to be sun hemp at 75 pounds per acre, millet at 50 pounds per acre, and buckwheat at 50 pounds per acre. So kind of high rates of all of those, except the sun hemp, and see what that works. So just trying to smother those weeds by higher rates and combinations of higher rates of different summer cover crops. And then another thing we're doing with that to kind of knock back the crabgrass is doing some stale seed bedding before we plant those.
If, say, I were going to expand my production into a field that were just pasture currently, and we are in the South, and I know that all of these details change when you move from region to region, so we can stick with the South if that's what you're comfortable with. So say if somebody were going to expand their production or go into production in pasture, so we're thinking mostly grasses and a few perennial weeds, what are some of the considerations you would have in setting up that field for a cover crop? And then what cover crops would be in your toolbox to sow? We're talking now at the end of May, so I'm thinking, setting up the field in May or June, and then sowing those cover crops in June, maybe July. What are some of your thoughts moving forward on setting up a field for cover crops for production, maybe in the later fall? And then, what would change, or what cover crops would you grow if you were setting that same field up for probably production next spring? So sort of two scenarios there, cover cropping for production in the fall and cover cropping for production the following spring.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, definitely depends on what's in your pasture. If you have, a perennial like Bermuda grass, that's going to take a different strategy than fescue, but we'll just pretend it's fescue. We just converted it into a fescue area. That's a lot easier to kill. And the summertime is a great time to kill it because it's kind of weakened by the heat in the summer anyways. So I would start with, tillage or tarping to eliminate, any grasses that are there, the fescue that's there, and any perennial weed. And, if you ideally can do that over a whole month period, that's going to help with the perennial weeds, because the perennial weeds, they'll just keep bouncing back unless you can kind of like exhaust their resources, those underground root systems that keep them going. So, but if you don't have a whole month, then you might have to contend with those perennials during the growing season while you've got your plants out there in the field, which can be a little more difficult with those perennials because they're, harder to cultivate. You've got a tree out there, whatever you're cultivating with might not work well on it, right. Blackberries or stuff like that. So all those perennials are kind of the hardest ones to get rid of, but they're the ones that kind of require the most tillage or the longest tarping period. So kind of, doing that as long as you can, and then going into, if you don't have much time, which if you're planting fall crops, you don't have a lot of time. So, you want something that's gonna grow fast and produce as much biomass as possible before then. So I'd probably do a mixture of cowpeas. Tend to grow pretty fast during the summertime, and if you can get 2 months of growth out of the cowpeas, that's pretty good. And mixing in Japanese millet, if you just have a couple months, Japanese millet will give you quite a bit. All the ones basically we're trying in our trial here. Sun hemp is another good one. A couple months of growth on that will give you quite a bit, biomass and nitrogen as well. Buckwheat is another good quick crop. So those are kind of my favorites, just because they grow so fast. And all those can be crimped except cowpeas. Cowpeas can't be crimped, but they're just a really aggressive nitrogen fixer. So if you're doing any tillage or tarping, definitely don't want to leave those out because they'll smother weeds and give you that nitrogen that you need. Now, if you're looking at the following year, prepping for the following year, then I would do something like Sudex, and Sudex and cowpeas are what I like to grow. So that's going to give you a lot more weed control. The Sudex has more allelopathic effects where it can act as an herbicide and emit some chemicals that will prevent weeds from growing. So ideally, if you're prepping for the following year, which is what I like to do, do that 1 month of tillage and then plant your Sudex and your cowpeas. And ideally with these cover crops, you're planting into moisture, and that gives you an advantage on the weeds. So what you do there is you basically, let a rain come in your tillage cycle, towards the end of your tillage cycle, let a rain come, and then as soon as it's dry enough to do a very light cultivation, and go in and do a light cultivation, and you ideally want there to be moisture underneath the soil that you're cultivating. And then you go through and try to get your seeds into that moisture so your seeds can come up before the rain brings up the next flush of weeds. To get those seeds into the moisture, your seeds will come up, and then a rain will come. And then once that rain comes, the weeds will start growing. But if your seeds can come up before that time period, they'll have a chance to start releasing those chemicals that will prevent those weeds from growing. And if you do that, you can get a really clean cover crop stand. Because one of the issues you have with cover cropping is that those weeds do come up and then go to seed during your cover cropping cycle. You either have to terminate your cover crop earlier to prevent those things from going to seed, or you're going to have those things going to seed and creating weeds the following year. And both of those situations aren't really good. You want your cover crop to grow as long as possible, and you can only do that if you don't have any weeds in there.
You all have done some high tunnel production there in the South, and I know that a lot of people's crops, except maybe tomatoes or cucumbers, have come out of the high tunnels, and we're going to be looking at producing in those high tunnels in the winter time. So do you have any tips with managing summer cover crops in the high tunnels? What are your favorite ones to use? How do you manage them in a high tunnel so that you can build the soil in the high tunnel for that late fall, winter, even early spring production?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I definitely like to cover crop during the hot part of the year when you're not really using your high tunnel. It's a great time to get the nutrients, and also, these cover crops can help with disease issues too, I think, as well. A lot of times you can't rotate enough in your high tunnel. So, growing these cover crops can be beneficial for increasing your rotations and preventing those disease problems, pest problems, and then building your soil and the nitrogen. So many benefits to the cover cropping, putting them in your high tunnel. But some of the issues, ideally you have some kind of a sprinkler system in there to keep your high tunnel going. A lot of people might just have drip in their high tunnel, but we do have two separate valves. I have a drip valve, and then I also have hanging like drop sprinklers that hang from the ceiling. It's basically just like a wobbler that comes down from the ceiling, and then that way you can irrigate. But, having some kind of overhead irrigation system, I think, is key. But one of the problems with cover cropping in the high tunnels is that, if your cover crop is growing right up to the ground stakes and on the edge of the greenhouse, that area is really difficult to manage with any kind of rototiller or mower. It's hard to mow the cover crop if it's growing right up to that edge. So what I like to do is the bed along the edge of the high tunnel is in landscape fabric, and I like to use the woven poly landscape fabric. That lasts like 5 years, and I'll usually place that along the edge when I'm building the greenhouse. So before the bows go in place, you have all the ground stakes in the ground. Then I'll place the landscape fabric over the top of that, burn holes where the ground stakes are, and then just slips right over that. And that gives you a great weed barrier along that edge. It also helps you manage the cover crops inside the greenhouse because you don't have to worry about tilling for mowing those cover crops right up to the edge, really difficult to manage. So I guess
I know that what we thought about that after the fact, and it was easy enough just to take a couple of feet of that fabric. I think you can get it in 4-foot rolls, and we split it down the middle, and used that and ran it up along the sideboards, the baseboards, about 6 inches on either side of the baseboard. Again, just trying to retrofit this solution. And that's worked really well with not only keeping the management around the baseboards down, but then not getting any of that the issues with getting any weeds up against the baseboard, getting any germination up against the baseboard that's just difficult to deal with.
Yeah. Oh, that's perfect. Yeah. Yes. I think retrofitting, anything you can do to make that area easier to manage, because that seems to be the biggest management challenge, I think, in high tunnels, those edges, that edge effect. Yeah, that's smart. Yeah, retrofitting it. So eventually, the fabric's going to decompose, and I'm going to have to retrofit ours to with something. But yeah, I think that helps with the cover cropping. And then, so my favorite cover crops are, cowpeas again. I've also done sweet potatoes in the high tunnel, and they have a great allelopathic effect. And I had an issue with yellow nutsedge in some of my high tunnels, and was able to completely eliminate that with sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes, for whatever reason, they emit these chemicals that just wipes out the yellow nutsedge. So if you do have a yellow nutsedge problem, definitely grow sweet potatoes, and that will get rid of it. And sweet potatoes might be able to get rid of some other weeds. I'm just not aware of them. But definitely a great ground cover. And then we've got some sweet potatoes to boot in the fall before you plant it again. But of course, it takes more time to plant those sweet potatoes. You have to plant them by hand, and a lot of times they don't have that time in the summertime. So just going in there and putting in cowpeas. Last year I did cowpeas and sun hemp. I think this year I'm going to do cowpeas and Sudex. And then just make sure that I mow that Sudex down before it gets too cellulosic. But the cowpeas and sun hemp worked great. I might actually mix cowpeas, sun hemp, and Sudex, all three of those together, and try that combination.
And then when you go to terminate that, is that something that you're going to crimp, or are you going to mow it, or till it in, or tarp it? How do you go about managing that when you're ready for the next stage?
Yeah, definitely mow and till it in, because with high tunnels you don't really want to have any kind of mulch on the soil, because the mulch will basically prevent soil from heating up, and then the soil heating up is what gives you that nighttime heat inside your high tunnels. You want that soil to be able to heat up and then re-radiate that heat at nighttime to keep all the plants warmer through the wintertime. So, if you do mulch, you'd want to have like black plastic or something that can transfer that heat into the soil. But yeah, having lots of residue in there can actually keep your greenhouse cooler. So that'd be something I would avoid. But just mowing it with a flail mower and then rotilling it into the ground. You just use like our walk behind DCS to do all the high tunnel work.
Yeah, and I've run into a few instances with cover crops that's been effective. If somebody maybe doesn't have an implement like that, especially if they're working on a smaller scale, you can mow it and tarp it. And if the tarp is left on there just long enough and you pull it back, you can actually rake those off into the pathways, or just rake it out completely to get back down to more of your base soil, or maybe put a layer of compost on top of that. Especially in a high tunnel, you're not going to have any of the wash or erosion issues.
Yeah.
But we're looking at taking we've already taken a lot of crops out of the high tunnel, and then we're looking at late tomato and fall greens production in there, and it's like, what can we do with cover crop to boost that soil like we can in the field? So that's really interesting, especially with the sweet potatoes. I never would have thought about the sweet potatoes.
Yeah, they work good. Yeah, I'm really interested with the whole tarping thing. Rachel's been a big proponent of that. It's kind of helping push our farm to try that out, and I really want to try that out next year. One of the issues we had this spring was it was just too wet to get into the field. With a tarping system, that doesn't really matter. You can just pull the tarp off whenever you need to, and the field is ready to go. You don't have to worry about the soil being dry enough to do the tillage. So I think in early spring, especially in a year like we had this year, and it's probably going to be every year with climate change, I think having that option is going to be critical. So we're looking at ways to do that on a larger scale, and looking at how we can pull the tarps out of the field with the tractor and how you can make turns with it. And one of the ideas we came up with, I don't know if it's going to work or not, but we're looking at putting T-posts in the ground and then putting PVC pipe over the top of the T-posts, and then trying to use those set up at the edge of the field so we can pull the tarp out and then use the tractor to pull it around a corner, so we can get the tarp into the edge of the field more effectively without having to fence, hundreds and hundreds of feet away from the edge of the field.
Yeah, that's one of the advantages of this 1, 2, 3 acre scale is moving tarps around and having that sort of in the tool belt. But I imagine at your scale, you've got to get really creative with how to use that to your advantage.
Yeah, we're looking at, we need to tarp, several acres basically. How can we do that effectively and move them around? But yeah, I think the tarping system just seems key, especially with climate change and not being able to use the tractor. Got to use something.
Thank you, Shawn. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good luck, everyone.
Real quick, we wanted to mention a few things that we've used to step up our cover crop game. And the first is, Shawn. We've reposted his presentation on cover cropping in the South. It's a great place to start. Second is greencoverseeds.com. Great place to buy and order cover crop seed by the pound. And last but not least is a reference book, Managing Cover Crops Profitably by Sayre. All these are linked in the show notes. That book has charts for cover cropping based on your goals, be it fixing nitrogen, building soil, fighting weeds or pests, specific to region, notes on performance, cultural traits, seeding rates, advantages and disadvantages, and even breaks down cover crops individually. Highly recommend picking this one up. It's a wonderful resource if you're interested in stepping up your cover crop game as well. With that, let's keep it covered, let's keep it planted, and take care out there.
All right, if you enjoyed that interview, make sure to follow Shawn's work at Wild Hope Farm. Also give Jackson a follow at Stonehouse Market Farm. I'll stuff the show notes with some links for you to click on. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it. Rate and review it. Share it. Seriously, that always helps us a lot. Post it in your stories or put it up on your Facebook or whatever. Do a TikTok dance with it. I don't know if that's a thing. Probably a thing. My theme song would make a good TikTok dance theme. Anyway, all of that helps. Huge thank you to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin. Enormous thank you to Hannah Crabtree for all her help. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.